So Adil, let's give you a few minutes to respond, and then if you could keep your questions short, so if you have 3 questions, maybe you could just ask one, and then you could ask the other 2 later. This would give people a greater chance more people a chance to participate.
Thanks very much, Francois. And also for the plug on the book. Upcoming is a little strong. I signed the contract 2 days ago. But it's never too early to get good press, so I appreciate that. So thanks very much for your comments. I'm just going to rattle off a few responses. So first, I completely agree that evidence relative permissibility turns on the evidence available to the actor and is not undermined by facts of which the actor is non-culpably ignorant. And if I suggested otherwise, then that was just a mistake in the way I was writing it. However, I do believe that the fact relative permissibility of an action depends on how the action turns out, not on how it will probably turn out. We should not launch attacks that will probably strike civilians because we should not launch attacks that strike civilians, not independently and not the other way around. Fact relative permissibility is the most basic form of permissibility from which the other forms of permissibility derive their moral importance. So what's most important is what we do, not what we try to do or will probably do. So the reasonable belief threshold places non-state armed groups at a disadvantage, or places the weaker party at a disadvantage. I would first note that war disfavors the weaker party, and most rules of war will disfavor the weaker party. Certainly the prohibition on intentionally killing civilians disfavors the weaker party. So the mere fact that a moral constraint disadvantages the weaker party isn't necessarily an objection to it. That may just be the way it is. It's one of the reasons why you don't want to be the weaker party. You have fewer permissible ways to achieve your objectives. So Francois asks, well, why couldn't you excuse or defend your conduct by saying, well, I reasonably believed I had a 45% chance of hitting my intended target, and given the relative values involved, that seemed like a good thing to do. I mean, there may be something more subtle going on in your question, because I think what you're just saying is, what if I have a reasonable belief in maximizing expected value? So my excuse is, well, by doing this, I would maximize expected value. And obviously, my paper argues that expected value alone can't justify an attack that you can't reasonably believe will strike a military target. Now, it's true that like all deontological constraints, the requirement of reasonable belief draws a sharp line, and it's always going to be possible to identify an action that falls just below that line and argue that it's arbitrary to prohibit that action while permitting another action that falls just above that line. But I think that's just an unavoidable implication of the view that morality is at least partly governed by rules. So it's not that it isn't a problem, it's just a general problem for non-consequentialist moral theories. So does reliance on probabilities always involve an impermissible form of aggregation? I don't think so. So my view is that a combatant must reasonably believe that her attack will strike a legitimate target. One reason for such a belief may be that her weapon usually strikes its intended target. But this epistemic role is quite different from the rule consequentialist moral justification for using such weapons that usually miss their intended target. So in other words, deontologists can make use of aggregate statistical trends not as a justification for their action, but only as an epistemic reason to believe that their particular action will prove justified on its own merits and in that very case. And so that seems quite different to me. With respect to the kind of different social groups, so first remember that in the cases that I use, what's important is not that the parties to the conflict are of the same political community, but that the civilians at risk in the particular strike are. So even if, Serbs are marching into a Bosnian town to kill Bosnians, and the Bosnian militias are trying to decide whether to try to strike at them, even though they may miss and kill their own civilians. The point is that the civilians are all of the same group, and so the attackers or putative attackers, the people contemplating launching the attack, have no greater associative obligation to one group of civilians or the other. They're all on a par. So that's the only important thing about that equalization of issues. Are there situations where non-combatants could also be legitimately held vicariously liable for the threats posed by their armed forces? No. Victor is full of ideas that are utterly brilliant and completely implausible, and vicarious liability to be killed is definitely one of them. And finally, do I actually think that the basic legal premise of civilian immunity is correct, and that my argument about imprecise weapons is morally true, all things considered? Yes, I do. So, thanks. Okay. All right, here we go. Okay, so I'm going to go rough. I'm just going to go geographically. So Jeff, Seth, Victor, and then I'll kind of go around.
Thanks. You and I have talked about this kind of problem before, but in the light of what you were saying today, I'm just wondering what you would say about this, having thought about it more. Suppose there are 10 people, and they're in a group, and we know one of them is a combatant who, if not killed, will do some act that will be highly deleterious to our ability to achieve our just cause. So we know that one of these people is this super combatant, and the other 9 are innocent civilians. In one case, we're flying over, and all we've got is one big bomb, and we can drop the bomb and blow them all up. And we know that we're going to be killing 10 people, 9 people. It's not going to be of any use to us at all. But in the circumstances, let's say it's highly DE proportionate to drop the bomb. In the other case, we fly over this cluster of people. All the same things are true, but we've got a single fire rifle rather than one big bomb, and we have to kill them one by one.
Yep.
And if one of them tries to run away or something, we've got to shoot him down. Does your view, as I think it does, distinguish between those two methods of killing the super combatants, so that it's permissible when we have the one big bomb, but not permissible when we have to shoot them one by one?
Not the view I expressed in this paper, but a view I expressed in a different paper, which was, I think, the one we were discussing at that time. So that paper was about target verification, which is about figuring out who's a combatant and who's a civilian, that sort of distinction. This paper is about discrimination. Let's say we know who everyone is. The question is, can we actually hit the person we want to hit? Right? So it's actually a somewhat different set of issues. So it's sort of a companion piece to the one before. But yeah, I do think that, So yeah, I think that, so in the verification piece, I argue that, yeah, you need to reasonably believe that the person you're targeting is liable to attack.
That's what raised the question.
Yeah.
In your comments just now, you made that remark that the combatant must reasonably believe that his target is a military target rather than a...
Right. And so this may seem paradoxical, and all I can say is that it's no more paradoxical than issues that come up with intention and foresight, right? So, suppose that there are, 3 people, 2 civilians, one who has, a rocket launcher, bomb, or grenade, whatever. It may be permissible to, throw a grenade or launch a rocket at them, because the guy with the grenade will potentially kill like 20 people if he manages to throw it. So that might be okay. But if the 2 civilians are in front of the person, it might not be permissible to shoot the 2 civilians so they drop to the ground so you can get at the guy with the grenade. So again, I think this is another instance. So I think deontological constraints generally can lead to these types of results, where the same outcome is permissible by one route but impermissible by another. And I think that's just a general feature of deontological constraints. Seth.
Okay, Adil. So here's another push at Francois' claim that you might be implicitly doing some aggregating in the way you're formulating your argument. Okay, so if we're talking about people's rights, then why should we care about the overall risk that you create? Why shouldn't we care about the risk that you subject each particular individual to? Okay, so suppose that in case 2 on your handout, there are 1,000 possible victims. So there's 1,000 people who could be among the 40 who would get killed. So of each person, it turns out that the risk he's subjected to, I'm sorry, no, in case 2, it's of among the 10 who you might kill. So of each person, it turns out that the risk he's subjected to is actually 0.007. So there's a 1 in 100 chance that he'd be one of the victims, and there's a 70 in 100 chance that those victims get killed. Whereas in the third case, the one where the odds are the other way around, each individual, suppose that there's only those 50 who could be killed. So each individual is subjected to a 0.3 chance of being killed. Right? So why should we care about the aggregate risk that you impose on this group of people rather than the risk that you impose on each individual person who could end up being killed by your action?
So tell me if I'm missing your point. So when we do proportionality, the typical proportionality case is you hit your military target, but civilians die as a side effect. We generally don't ask, well, so say we anticipate 10 civilian casualties as a result of destroying this target. We generally don't ask sort of which 10 it will be, right? So say there are 10 on one side, 10 on another, and 10 on the third, and one of the walls is going to collapse. We don't know which one. It'll kill the 10 that are on that side. I don't think we generally feel like that is that relevant. We know 10 will die, and that's the most important thing.
Maybe,
which
but
10?
That's maybe because we don't care so much about, we think it's okay to aggregate and not regard each person individually. Mm-hmm. On your approach, which seems to want to identify a right against being subjected to a certain degree of risk, essentially. Surely what matters is each individual's right not to be subjected to. So on your account, basically, each individual who's subjected to a 0.007 risk, in the first case as I described it, has a claim against you that you not drop the bomb, which each individual who's subjected to a 0.3 risk in the other case doesn't have. And it seems odd that they really only have that claim on your account in virtue of the fact that there are a number of other people who are also subjected to that risk, which seems to imply, again, that we're doing the sort of aggregating that you wanted to avoid. Maybe you just want to say that this is okay aggregation and that's bad aggregation. But I think if you want this sort of individuated account, you need to look at the risks that each individual is subjected to.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to have to think more about what you're saying. My sense is that this is not a form of aggregation that raises the same kind of moral problem, partly because what's problematic is when you infringe somebody's rights or risk infringing their rights, and your justification for that turns on aggregation in some way, or entirely turns on aggregation in some way. But the moral reason not to do something, it may be okay for that to depend on aggregation. Those may raise different types of moral concerns. But I'm going to have to think more about that, though. That's really interesting.
Thanks very much for the paper. So I feel the pull of the intuitions in the cases, but I wasn't sure about the explanation. And the reason why is I think that you haven't got the epistemology straight. So you haven't got the epistemology straight. And here's why I think that. You seem to think that I reasonably believe that P, if there's more than a 50% chance of P. And I don't think that's generally true. Mm-hmm. I think when we have reasonable beliefs, when we say I believe that P, and when it's appropriate to assert that, will depend on a range of contextual factors. Mm-hmm. And when you get this right in these contexts, I think that you're going to have a very, very restrictive rule, more restrictive than the one you want. Think about the 70-30 case. Imagine that I'm flying over and I drop the bombs, and now there's a 70% chance that I've hit the military target and a 30% chance that I've hit the civilians. Imagine that I drop the bombs into a fog and I don't know what's happened yet. Is it appropriate for me to assert that I believe that I haven't killed any civilians? I think not. So I think that it would be wrong for me to say that. I think it would be disrespectful for me to say that. I think all I should say is I reasonably believe that I probably haven't. But I think if I say I reasonably believe that I haven't, I just don't give appropriate weight to the fact that I've taken a 30% risk of killing these civilians. So when it's, in this case, I think it's inappropriate for me to assert that I believe that I haven't done the thing that's fact relative, impermissible. And this goes in a way to Francois' thought as well, that when there's something arbitrary about the 50% line, you responded to that and said, well, deontic constraints will always have these kind of line drawing problems. I don't think that's quite true, actually. So you think about the acts and omissions distinction or the intent foresight distinction. It's true that sometimes there are grey areas in these things where where the threshold is not precise and sharp. I think that's true of the acts and omissions distinction. But I don't think it's true that there's just a continuum and then at some point we break the continuum. We have two different ideas and then there's a slightly indeterminate bit in the middle. Whereas in the probability case, it looks like there's just a continuum where you've drawn an arbitrary line on a continuum, and that looks like it's more worrying to me.
Okay, so second point first. So I actually thought I was doing the latter, that below the reasonable belief threshold, it's all impermissibility all the time, right? There's really nothing that great to be said about acting below the reasonable belief threshold. It's only above that, at least permissibility becomes an option, and then you can look at D, proportionality, and other considerations above that marker. So I didn't think that my view was a continuum view.
No, it's just there's a continuum of probabilities,
Sure.
and then you draw an arbitrary line on the continuum, and that looks like it's worrying, because it looks like it doesn't have a good moral driver to it.
Well, so whether reasonable belief is arbitrary or not, I think, well, so you mean the 50% you think is arbitrary?
Right, so you've
Well,
just got a continuum of probabilities of something
Right.
being true.
Right.
And then you just draw a cut.
Yeah.
That's not the way in which other deontic constraints, in other deontic constraints, there's no smooth continuum like that, where you've just got a cut on a smooth continuum. So that's why those constraints they're picking out different ideas. Whereas in this case, you've just got this smooth continuum of probabilities and you've got a cut. And that looks like it looks more dubious morally, because it's hard to justify why you would draw the cut at any particular point.
Well, but there's a difference between saying reasonableness, the reasonableness of a belief depends on the balance of reasons, and that balance can shift, and in that sense, there's sort of a continuum going on. But then from a moral perspective, it's only once you have reasonable belief that the justificatory enterprise gets off the ground. So I don't think that kind of continuum is problematic, just given the way reasons work. On the epistemic point, so it's true. So sometimes we talk about belief in terms of sort of affirmation, right? And sometimes we talk about it in terms of kind of credence. So it may be that it would be disrespectful, as you say, when you come back from your mission to say, I definitely hit my target. I believe I hit my target. I believe that I didn't hurt any civilians. That may be disrespectful in some way. It may show a lack of sensitivity to the risks that you just took. And so maybe you shouldn't affirm yet that. But I think it is true that your reason to believe that you hit your target is stronger than your reason to believe that you missed and killed civilians. And so in that sense, your belief is reasonable.
I think I should just say I believe I probably did. I don't think you should assert, and I don't think you should believe that you did.
So that may
Not hit
be,
the target.
but then why not say that with everything, right? So why not always say, I believe that, my glass is probably empty, very likely empty, almost certainly empty. That's what I believe, rather than just saying, no, I believe it's empty. I mean, I could be looking at it at a weird angle, but I believe it's empty.
There's lots of contextual reasons.
I'm sure. No, longer conversation. Oh, I think Saba.
So I think this is a softball question because I think it turns out
Thank
having.
you.
I think it turns out having missed a part of the argument. So it seemed that the thesis can be recast as follows: is that we have moral reasons to be risk averse with respect to what we do in war, even if being risk averse results in more deaths in the long run.
That's, I guess, it's a way of characterizing the implication of my view.
Okay, so my question is this: if the reason that we have not to be risk averse, even though it might prevent more harms in the long run, is that it disrespects those that we would be killing now, then, I mean, how do we, and this is the part where in the argument I think I'm missing, I mean, how would we justify what the tactical bomber does, for example? I mean, they drop bombs knowing that they're going to kill civilians, but the idea is that what makes it permissible is that it'll save more lives in the future. So do you think that sort of case is impermissible?
I don't think it's impermissible, but I think you have to ask. So we very seldom ask, how sure are you that the military advantage you're seeking will actually be achieved by your attack and will actually contribute to victory? That's just a question I don't think any of us have really explored in any depth. But it's certainly a really important question to ask. I mean, so in the law, they try to fudge it by saying, well, the military advantage has to be concrete and direct, right? And so that can alleviate some of these concerns about uncertainty. But in philosophy, I don't think we've really come up with a great way to understand how sure you have to be that the military advantage is actually going to come about.
But you do think that we can kill people now to save people in the future?
As a side effect of doing something that will save people later.
Okay, then I guess I'm not terribly sure why that doesn't generalize to the claim that we ought not to be risk averse, precisely because it'll save people in the future.
Well, maybe we should be risk averse in that context too, like in the side effect context too, and we just haven't understood yet what that involves. Yeah. And so next up was Dick.
I'm suspicious of the idea of prohibitions on weapons on the ground that they're indiscriminate. And I don't think you can separate out this question from an indiscriminate weapon is a weapon that will kill anybody in an everybody in an area. It'll obliterate everybody within 3 inches or 3 feet, 3 square miles, 100 square miles. Whether that's okay or not, I think from your standpoint, should depend on whether the civilians or non-combatants are entitled to be in that space, right? And I mean, so I think, I mean, in general, I mean, for one thing, Mexico is fighting a just war against the United States. They need to attack Del Mar. And so they just pass out leaflets or send cell phone messages to people in Del Mar, like, hey, there's going to be a battle tomorrow. You need to get out of the way. Or maybe it can just be obvious. The people in Del Mar can just turn on CNN and they'll see that there's going to be a battle. And so, and moreover, if it's a just war, I think civilians on both sides have a duty of accommodation and at least not get in the way and maybe to facilitate the just war effort. So an analogy from Robert Nozick, if I'm in my office minding my own business and some mafia guys come and hide in the adjoining offices and the police come after them, I can't say, oh, I have a right to be here. I'm writing my paper for the Journal of Obscure Metaphysics. I have a duty to get. I have a duty to get out of the way. I don't have a right to occupy that space. And it seems to me there could be very well situations where the police can shoot at me, or where my right not to be shot at, morally is extinguished or reduced by virtue of my lack of entitlement to be there. So even and I think in general, if it's World War II and Allied troops are rumbling through Germany, or France and Germany, and this is a just cause, I think the civilians have a very large duty to get out of the way, leaving their homes if need be. Whatever you think on the issue, I don't think you can, the general point is not how it comes out specifically, but that you can't avoid this question, you can't, of entitlement to occupy the space. Another kind of consideration is just, you might just think people are just unjust occupiers. The colonialists in Algeria have no right to be there, and they should leave. They're unjust occupants of the space, and so being non-combatants, they're still, we can still, if we have a bomb that's going to blow up within a 100-square-mile area, but there may be nobody there who's entitled to be there, and has a right not to be killed as a result of military operations. Again, I don't mean to settle the questions. I just mean the question's open.
Yeah, no, I think I think these are great questions that are being debated. So first, even if civilians do have a duty of some kind to leave an area where combat operations are ongoing or about to begin, one question would be, what is the moral consequence of breaching that duty, of not leaving when they ought to? Is it liability to be killed? I doubt it. As a practical matter, so two things. So first, looking at it from the perspective of a combatant, to be honest, I don't really care why civilians are in harm's way, whether they live there or they're passing through or they're involuntary human shields. I just know that they're there, and now I have to take that into account. Yeah, I don't know that I really. So okay, so. Yeah. So first, again, I don't think it matters, because even if civilians had a duty to vacate an area of combat operations, I don't know whether the implication of their breaching that duty would be you can now kill them and discount their deaths. That seems like a very extreme reaction. Now, partly that's because of practical considerations. Often the reasons why civilians don't leave is because they're old, they're sick or disabled, they're children, the roads and bridges have been obliterated, there are bombs falling and they feel like maybe it's safest to just stay where they are. The leaflets that are falling are being tossed by an adversary who's killing their people. Yeah.
Think of a moral shield.
Yep.
It protects you morally against being harmed.
Yep.
It gets thinner and thinner, with this fact, and sometimes it disappears.
You know, again, people argue this sort of thing. I tend to resist those types of moves. I think you pretty much have to take the combat zone the way you find it and the civilians in it as they are, and then try to do the right thing. And just because they may be, acting reckless, or, carelessly or whatever, I don't think that really necessarily changes much.
Let's move on to the next question.
Who is Mateus?
I basically had the same question as Victor. I just want to give another example. And it's perhaps a little bit unfair. Just imagine you play Russian roulette with me, and you have a revolver with 6 shots, and you only put 2 bullets in there, and then you tell me, I reasonably believe that I won't shoot you. I mean, this is not really, obviously it's another example, but it's so disrespectful in taking up. And so it seems that your argument presses you that you should have 100% probability. So only if you take the revolver, there's no shot in there. If the attack is certain that it will not kill any. So why isn't it 100%? Which then would make it unfeasible, but still.
So the Russian roulette case isn't really a problem for me, because I'm not saying that reasonable belief is sufficient for evidence relative justification. I'm just saying it's necessary, right? So basically, even if you had a 1,000-chamber revolver, right, and then with 1 bullet in it, I think it would still be a terrible thing to pull the trigger, right? Because your reason for taking that risk, small as that risk may be, is totally trivial, right? To have some laughs or whatever. And so it would still be impermissible on that basis. So I don't think that example is necessarily a problem for me. And then I didn't quite follow the second. Was the second part built on the first, or was it a separate point?
It was basically, again, that if you say, I have reason to believe that I won't kill the dead anyway, it's the same as Victor, that you're rather going to 100%, because otherwise you would have to say, I take the risk, and that's what I'm doing, and I'm gambling with those lives in a certain way. So I said, you can't just eliminate that. And that's only why I'm sure that Russian roulette is unnecessary, it's important anyway.
Sure.
It was only about the fact that whether you could say, I reasonably believe I won't kill you.
Yep.
But that's even a sensible statement.
Yeah, no, I think what you say what you say is, look, I'm launching an attack. I reasonably believe it's going to hit my target and it's not going to hurt you. But it may. There is a substantial chance that it may. And I'm really sorry to impose that risk on you. But if I don't, there's an even greater risk that something else even worse will happen. And look, I'm a human being. I'm fallible, right? My actions don't always turn out the way I want them to. So this may go awry as well. I'm really sorry about that, but this is the situation I'm in. I'm trying to do the right thing by you and by the other people affected by my action. So, I hope you can understand that. And that's the sort of defense that you could offer to the civilians in those cases.
Adil, can we find someone who hasn't participated?
Oh, sure. So I was just kind of going geographically. Okay, but you had your hand up? Yeah. Yeah.
So early on in the talk, you avoid some jurisprudence controversies by saying you're just going to take as a premise that we're going to pin down the moral underpinnings of the law, and working out what those say is going to be conclusive for working out how to interpret the law. I guess I mean, if that were true, that would be awesome, right? I'd like it if things turned out that way. But I wanted to hear a little more of the justification for that premise. Particularly, it seems plausible that there's going to be more than one non-textual factor that's going to be relevant to the legal interpretive question. And if that's true, then it seems like, well, maybe figuring out how the moral underpinnings work are going to be only part of the answer to the legal interpretive question. So can you just say a little more about that, how to justify that premise?
Sure. I mean, so the basic idea is that if the law says, don't use imprecise weapons, but then doesn't tell you how imprecise is too imprecise, you need to answer that question somehow. And there are only a limited number of ways of doing so. You can look at commentary on the treaty. You can look at state practice. You can, and you can engage. And so those are kind of your positive sources, source-based reasons. But if they're indeterminate too, as I think they are, then really the best you can do is try to ask yourself, well, what is the best, what is the best moral justification for this law? What would make it make the most sense and achieve the aims of its drafters? Now, if there was contrary evidence that actually the drafters didn't want a morally optimal law, they wanted something limited or flawed in some way, then that would obviously be very significant, but we don't really have that. So all we have is the idea that imprecision can sometimes entail impermissibility, and then we should try to figure out, well, when does it and why, and things like that. Again, if there's a joke, I'm not going to get it right, that do the right thing when all else fails, I think, right? And so if all else fails, if there really are no positive legal sources to tell you otherwise, you may as well just do the right thing. Because after all, whether you're a military lawyer or a judge or whoever, you're a person, first and foremost, moral reasons attached to you. And so if the law and your legal obligations don't preclude you from doing what would ordinarily be the morally right thing, you should do the morally right thing.
So I guess there's one worry to press this a little bit is that it seems like, sure, it's hard to imagine that someone writing the treaty wants to have a flawed or false principle, but that's not the only way to get this countervailing type of interpretive oomph, right? They might just be confused. Maybe they want to write the morally correct treaty, but they've got something in mind and it's not quite right. And that seems like the kind of thing we could have pretty, evidence for. We could talk to the people that wrote the treaty. So, why doesn't that stuff end up being countervailing evidence for the interpretive question?
It could be, but again, the basic aim of a legislator, a lawmaker, is that they make law, that they succeed in actually promulgating a legal norm. And if there's a way to salvage their attempt to do that, then we're satisfying their most basic objective. And so if they were just confused about what imprecision involves or what indiscrimination involves, then the best thing we can do for them to carry their project on is to help give meaning to what they were trying to do. The best meaning possible. That's the idea.
So let's thank our speaker at this point.
Thank you. I didn't realize we went over.
No, you're fine. So it's time for a 15-minute break. We'll come back at 10:45.